This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. A botched renewable heat initiative has precipitated a crisis that threatens to scuttle the current power-sharing agreement in Northern Ireland. Since the 1998 Good Friday Agreements, a system of devolved government has been in place in which parties favoring a united Ireland share power with those who wish to remain part of the UK. The collapse of this arrangement means that after nearly 2 decades, the British government may once again assume direct control. Complicating the situation is last year's Brexit vote, which could reunite old animosities by isolating Northern Ireland from the rest of the Irish Republic as the UK leaves the European Union. Here to untangle the complex issues of devolution and post-Brexit politics, we're joined by Timothy McMahon, Associate Professor of History at Marquette University, who also serves as Vice President of the American Conference for Irish Studies. Tim, welcome back.
Thanks, Doug.
Well, let's start with the basics. Now, the United Kingdom is the United Kingdom because there are constituent parts. So talk a little bit about this notion of devolved government.
Okay, well, first of all, I think especially for Americans, we're so used to thinking about federal systems and state constitutions as well as a federal constitution. That's not the system at all in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom was created, frankly, over several centuries, ultimately coming together as something similar to what we know now at the turn of the 19th century, when Ireland passed an act of union and Britain passed an act of union that united those two kingdoms. But 100 years earlier than that, the Scots had done the same thing. The Welsh had been incorporated even a couple hundred years before that with England. So ultimately you get this United Kingdom coming together. But in various parts of the United Kingdom, there were people who didn't want to remain. And in particular in Ireland, you had a strong push for an independent state. And you had sort of 2 different approaches, one of which was more working through the constitutional system, electing representatives to Parliament, and pushing for a devolved government. Then you had another wing that was more inclined to use violence and that sought a cleaner break, one that would not be subservient to the government in London. Devolved meaning simply that whatever powers you wield are actually given from the central government and they can take them away. And what ultimately came to pass in the 1920s, at least in the case of Ireland, was that 2 states were created, in part because over the course of the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s, a substantial population of people with closer ties to Britain were settled in parts of the island of Ireland, most particularly in the north. And so rather than, if you will, leaving them into a state dominated by their political opponents, as the independent Irish state looked like it would be, they created 2 governments on the island. I say they, this of course would be by act of Parliament from London. That was further complicated by an Irish War of Independence, which was simultaneously going on. That War of Independence helped to reshape the government in what we think of today as the Irish Republic into a more fully independent state. So that's not a devolved government there. But what exists in Northern Ireland is a devolved government. And it's been reshaped several times over the ensuing 95 years.
So, of course, you've had the period known as the Troubles, where there was a lot of violence between Republicans and Unionists in the North.
Right.
And 1998 comes along. The Good Friday Accords are signed, and what did they do?
Okay, well, so here again, when I say that Northern Ireland was reshaped, the devolved government was reshaped several times, for much of the 20th century, the Northern Irish government was dominated by the majority of people who called themselves Unionists. Politically, they were known as Unionists because they favored union with the United Kingdom. For the most part, these were Protestants and the descendants of those people who had settled, as I mentioned earlier. They were opposed by a nationalist minority, but a sizable minority that by the 1970s was pushing over 40% of the population. That minority pointed out, particularly through a civil rights movement that was partially inspired by our own civil rights movement in the U.S., inequities in Northern Ireland society, the way that justice was administered in the interests of one community over another, the way that jobs were being issued to one group over another, housing monies, this sort of thing, and indeed gerrymandered districts. So you didn't have a system of one man, one vote, for example. But the government tried to stop that movement. And ultimately what ends up happening is violence erupts in the late 60s, which continues for the better part of 30 years. And it's not until we get into the 1990s that a sustained system of negotiation between representatives of, if you will, the violent nationalist wing, as well as a more moderate nationalist wing, and unionist parties, and the governments of Britain and the Republic of Ireland were able to cobble together this agreement that was known as the Good Friday Agreement. And actually the U.S. was heavily involved in that process as well. Ultimately what they did was they set up a system of shared governance in which the cabinet of the Legislative Assembly in Northern Ireland would be made up of representatives of the largest parties. And there had to be people from both the nationalist community and the unionist community in that cabinet. So, for example, rather than having a prime minister, you have a first minister, who is essentially the parliamentary leader of the largest unionist party, and a deputy first minister, who's the leader of the largest nationalist party. Initially, those two leaders were David Trimble of the Ulster Unionist Party and John Hume. Ultimately, Hume passed that to his own second, Seamus Mallon, of the Social Democratic and Labour Party. These were more centrist parties than the more radical parties that we think of, like Sinn Féin on the nationalist side and the Democratic Unionists on the unionist side. But what happened in those early days of power sharing was that uncertainties over the way that the agreement would work pushed more voters toward those extremes. So that shortly after 2000, with the new institutions barely getting started, in an election that took place at that point, the Democratic Unionist Party, led by Reverend Ian Paisley, overtook the Ulster Unionists on the one hand, and Sinn Féin overtook SDLP on the other. And they ultimately had to put together a working arrangement.
So, fast forward a bit, it worked more or less for quite a while. Mm-hmm. And then that brings us to the story of cash for ash. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, for about 10 years now, Sinn Féin and the DUP have worked side by side, in fact, almost unbelievably well in the first days, where you had this very vocal and dynamic speaker in Paisley on the one hand, and Martin McGuinness, who was the leader of Sinn Féin in the north on the other. And he had been a commanding officer in the IRA in Londonderry during the Troubles. And yet they got along swimmingly. Now, there have been two transitions in the leadership of the DUP since power sharing with those two parties commenced. Peter Robinson first, and then Arlene Foster. And particularly Arlene Foster, who's only been in charge for about a year now, she and McGuinness do not have the best relationship. And a number of issues have surfaced which have kind of been simmering in the background that made the relationship tense. And the most important of these was the so-called cash for ash. This was a renewable heat incentive program that essentially would have given subsidies to businesses that used particular boilers that were more efficient. But the rate at which they would be paid out was set so high that the government was actually overpaying for the use of those fuels, to the tune of 490 million pounds over the course of about 20 years. Now that translates to roughly $640 million.
Well, and there were stories of farmers who could run these heaters in empty buildings and just make more money than they ever could farming.
Right. Well, and what makes it a particularly important and juicy story relative to Arlene Foster is that she was the Minister for Enterprise at the time that this program was brought forward.
So very much on her watch.
Yes, absolutely. And when in the fall of 2016, there were efforts within the Assembly to potentially bring down the government, or at least open a serious investigation into the cash for ash, they were more or less shunted aside. And it's only in the last couple of weeks, indeed after Sinn Féin broke away from the power sharing agreement, that she came out and said, oh, well, we'll bring up an investigation. And even representatives of other parties like the Alliance Party and the SDLP have said, too little, too late. And this has brought about a situation where now there's going to be a new election.
So interesting aspect of the power sharing. If one of those two ministers resigns, the other one's out of a job well, right?
That's right.
So Martin McGuinness then says, that's enough. This scandal was the last straw, and he resigns.
Right, and as I said, there were a number of other issues that were simmering, and so, for instance, one that had particular resonance among the nationalist community was the treatment of the Irish language in Northern Ireland, and just to emphasize how in many ways petty the DUP representation was toward the Irish language. At the time that the way forward for Sinn Féin and DUP to cooperate with one another was negotiated, that was in 2006, there was actually language in that so-called St. Andrews Agreement that would have called for an Irish Language Act to be brought forward by the power-sharing government, and that's never happened. Moreover, as recently as just a couple of weeks ago, you had the Minister for Communities saying that he was going to be cutting 50,000 pounds in support to Irish language causes, which were primarily causes that were favored by the nationalist community. He subsequently found the 50,000 pounds. But again, this was after McGuinness said enough was enough.
So you've got this background of increasingly bad blood between the two communities at just the time when now new elections have to occur to try to reconstitute this power-sharing agreement. Right.
And that's complicated further by, frankly, a generational change that's going to happen, at least within Sinn Féin. Martin McGuinness, as I said, has been the leader in Northern Ireland, but in addition to his desire to push the issues that the DUP has held up, McGuinness is suffering from a genetic issue that is affecting his heart, and his health has deteriorated quite dramatically in recent months. And just today, what are we today, the 19th of January, he announced that he would not be running in the upcoming elections. So he announced that he was resigning as Deputy First Minister just 10 days ago. There was some talk that maybe a new compromise could be worked out, and representatives from Britain, representatives from the Irish Republic tried to facilitate that, but already by last weekend it was clear that wouldn't happen. And so the election was set for March 2nd. So it's coming up very fast. So
in the interim, how does this affect sort of Westminster's role in governing?
Well, I mean, ideally, the parties are able to continue to work within the structures that were set up in 1998 and then reconstituted in 2006. it's not sure, or not certain that that's going to happen. And in fact, there's one of the ironic things that people were saying this week is that here is Sinn Féin, which has represented a harder line Republican position, one that favors unification between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic and fully leaving the United Kingdom. Here is Sinn Féin being willing to bring down the government, and after March 2nd, if they can't reconstitute something, you might have to go back to a system of direct rule. Because part of the devolution, as I said before, is that those are powers that are essentially given to the people of Northern Ireland by the centre, by the government based in London. If they fall apart, London has to take responsibility again. So here's Sinn Féin potentially setting up a situation where you would have direct rule again. I think they're going to do everything they can to make the devolved situation work, but we'll have to see. And as you said in your introduction, the whole thing is complicated by the Brexit situation.
So let's talk a little bit about that. You know, the north of Ireland is part of the UK.
Right.
If the UK pulls out of the EU, the north goes with it. And what many people are concerned about is the Republic of Ireland, the rest of the island would still be in. And so suddenly you've got a hard border potentially where, you know, if you're in the Republic, you're in the EU. If you're in the North, you're no longer in the EU. And
right.
So all that ease of travel and other kinds of mobility goes away.
Right. I mean, this situation is incredibly complex. And I don't believe that any of the people who advocated Brexit in the run-up to the vote that took place last June throughout the United Kingdom, I don't think anyone who advocated Brexit had even considered the implications for Ireland. The Irish people watched it and did so with great interest because I think they recognized it. The fact is that the United Kingdom, and specifically the people, let us say, in England, they recognize themselves as an island people. The fact is the United Kingdom has people on multiple islands, and the second largest of them is the island of Ireland, and 6 counties of that are Northern Ireland. And there is, in fact, a land border in the United Kingdom with the EU, and that's the border with the Republic of Ireland. And so, as you say, the question now is, what will the implications of that be? The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Theresa May, said just 4 days ago that she wants to continue with the easy movement between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic.
Something around 30,000 people a day are estimated
Absolutely.
to transit back and forth. And
Yes.
right now it looks a little bit like going from one American state to another.
This is much what it looks like, and there's regular train service. There's regular. I mean, people are on the highways every day. I mean, I was just in October. I spent the night in County Cavan, which is in the Republic. The next day in County Tyrone, which is in Northern Ireland, and then I flew out of Dublin and drove to the Dublin airport that night. And I was back and forth across the border 3 times over the course of that day. This is a part of daily life that people have come to appreciate since 1998. There's always been movement across the border, but until the 1920s, the border didn't exist at all. And it was only with the advent of the Troubles that it became a fully militarized situation. And that's been demilitarized since '98. And yet, if there is, control of migration, as the Brexit advocates wanted, that probably does have implications for that land border. And
another issue is the lion's share of trade from the Republic goes to the UK.
Yes.
They're the biggest customer, obviously. They would be unable, under EU regulation, to cut a separate deal with the UK as the Irish Republic. It has to be a bilateral EU and UK. So they're saying, by pulling out, you're isolating us from our biggest trading partner. So that's another aspect, right? The Republic is looking for dispensation from the EU, from Brussels, to be able to cut a side deal.
the concern within the Republic, and the Ministry of Finance, Department of Finance has done a lot of work on this within the Irish Republic. What are the implications of a hard Brexit? And it does seem now that, at least on economic issues, this is what Theresa May's government is aiming for. They don't want to be part of the single market. They don't want the free flow of people and goods. They're trying to negotiate a separate agreement with the EU. If that agreement isn't reached, then the World Trade Organization tariff regulations kick in. And what the Irish government has concluded is that the Irish GDP would actually be 3.5% smaller within 5 years if that happens. Particular sectors that would be badly affected include the cattle. Meat exports, they expect, might actually go down by as much as 50%, dairy by as much as 30%. That would have enormous implications for the economy in the Irish Republic.
So getting back to the devolved government in the North, what role or seat at the table might they have in Brexit negotiations, and how does a non-existent or dysfunctional assembly play into that?
Right. This is a really interesting complication. We're dealing here with really constitutional innovation, but with deep roots in the British constitutional tradition. Again, just to distinguish for American viewers, they don't have a written constitution in the same way that the U.S. does. The constitutional tradition in Britain is one that is based on statute and custom and court rulings. And one of the questions, for example, about Brexit is, how do they actually begin the process? Mrs. May's government has tried to say that the cabinet could simply call for the invocation of Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, which is essentially Britain saying, okay, now we want out.
And then the clock starts to run.
And the clock starts to run, and there's 2 years to negotiate their formal exit from the EU. The issue here, though, is that sovereignty rests with Parliament. And in fact, there's a Supreme Court case now in the United Kingdom which is saying that Parliament is the only entity that can actually invoke Article 50. And it's looking, I think, reading tea leaves, as if that's probably going to win the day. That said, there's also a tradition, particularly because in the United Kingdom, there were 2 other devolved institutions created in the 1990s. One, the Scottish Parliament; another, the Welsh Assembly. They actually have what they call consent review, so that they can look at any bill that Parliament might put forward that has implications for them. Northern Ireland, with its devolved government, also has that. And this is a case that they put in also as part of that Supreme Court business that's going on. The problem, though, now there's no government in Northern Ireland. And so the question is, how does that move forward? And so that may delay things just a little bit more until the situation's resolved. Whether that might pressure the cabinet in London to say, okay, let's go with direct rule faster if negotiations in March don't work or not, I don't know.
So is there, in all of this, any prospect for the kind of referendum we saw in Scotland, where, the people of the North could just say, you know what, we just want to, unite with the Republic, and that's that? And what would the numbers look like in that kind of referendum?
Well,
you guys?
This is again something that has been talked about since the Brexit vote back in June. If we look at the United Kingdom as a whole, right? So the 4 constituent nations: England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. Overall, the vote was about 51.9% to exit, right, to leave, and 48.1% to remain. But if you break that down by constituency and you look specifically at Northern Ireland, about 56% of the people in Northern Ireland actually voted to remain within the EU. So that's a significant majority, frankly, a much stronger majority than you had countrywide to leave. But interestingly enough, the Democratic Unionists and Arlene Foster, they actually favored the leave side.
And there's we're running out of time quickly,
yeah.
but there's a school of thought that says Mrs. May needs the DUP vote, and it may not be playing it right down the middle between those communities. Right?
You know, a possible signal of this, right, and that has great resonance for Irish history, is that after Mrs. May became Prime Minister in the summer, she declared that her party, the Conservative Party, would now be known as the Conservative and Unionist Party, which, not coincidentally, was the name it took on in the early 1900s when Irish nationalists were trying to put forward Home Rule legislation, and that linked Ulster Unionist politicians and Conservative politicians in Britain proper. And so that she started to use that language again, I think, is really quite telling.
Well, as so many issues we cover on this show, this is one we're going to have to watch and keep an eye on. In any case, thank you very much for being with us once again, and maybe when we've got a bit more of the story to tell, you can come back.
My pleasure.
In the meantime, to our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.